He was a millionaire widower, cold, calculated, and never seen smiling in public. She was a former schoolteacher, quiet, steady, and invisible to high society. So, why did he kiss her his secretary in front of hundreds of people and the cameras? Was it part of a deal, a carefully planned stunt, or something much more complicated and heartbreakingly real? What happens when two people who've stopped believing in love are asked to fake it? And what if somewhere between pretending and protecting, they discover a version of love they never dared to hope for? In a world full of expectations, rumors, and second chances, can quiet gestures speak louder than grand promises? Can a kiss that wasn't planned become the moment that rewrites everything? This is not a story about fairy tales. It's a story about late love, silent healing, and two people learning how to stay together. If you believe in quiet, powerful love, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Let's begin. It all began with a kiss, one she didn't expect, and he didn't plan. In front of strangers, cameras, and an entire town square. The evening had arrived like it always did. This time of year, polished, pleasant, and predictable. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala was a Charleston tradition, hosted beneath strings of white lights and towering oaks whose roots ran deeper than the oldest buildings around them. The air was tinged with salt from the harbor, sweetened by early autumn's bloom, and buzzed with the hum of polite conversation and ambition. Grace Bennett stood quietly beside Edward Whitmore, her hands folded in front of her, half hidden by the soft gray of her wool coat. She wasn't supposed to be there, as anything more than a quiet presence, his assistant, his right hand, the woman who managed his calendars and calmed his storms behind closed doors. Not someone meant to draw attention, and yet all eyes were on her now. She'd reached up to adjust his lapel, just a gentle, reflexive motion to brush off a leaf that had landed there. And that was when it happened. Without warning, without a word. Edward leaned down and kissed her, not on the cheek, not a polite gesture, but a kiss full on the mouth, simple, steady, deliberate. For a moment, everything stilled. The chatter around them dimmed into a low murmur. Grace's breath caught somewhere in her chest, her body frozen mid-motion, as if the world had tilted and no one had warned her. The kiss was not passionate in the way romance novels might describe. It wasn't heated or dramatic, but it was real. That, she felt instantly, real enough to send a rush through her veins, to make her knees unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with the heels she wore. And then it ended. Edward stepped back slowly, his expression unreadable, not cold, not embarrassed, just still, composed, the way he always was, even when everything inside him might have been burning. He looked at her as though waiting for her to understand something, without him having to say it aloud. She didn't understand. The crowd, of course, reacted. Murmurs rippled like wind across tall grass. Several guests exchanged glances. A few lifted their phones discreetly, pretending to check messages but clearly aiming lenses. Flashbulbs popped like distant fireworks. And then, from across the crowd, Clara Duval turned to look. Clara, the woman Edward's mother had been so gently, yet persistently, suggesting he consider more seriously. The woman whose father sat on the board of one of Edward's largest development projects. She watched them for a full second, unreadable. Then she gave the smallest, most gracious nod Grace had ever seen, controlled, graceful, and deadly, and turned away. Grace's heart knocked against her ribs, confused and loud in her chest. She and Edward didn't speak as they made their way through the gathering, offering polite smiles, nods, and thank yous. The champagne in her hand felt suddenly ridiculous. Her lipstick surely smudged, but she couldn't bring herself to wipe it away. Not yet. The car ride back was silent. Not the cold kind of silence. Not awkward either. It was suspended. Like both of them were standing on opposite ends of a narrow beam, afraid to move and knock the balance off. Grace kept her eyes on the streetlights as they flickered across the windshield, turning familiar streets into moving shadows. The city passed by in gentle glimmers, brick buildings, wrought iron balconies, closed boutiques whose windows reflected versions of herself she barely recognized anymore. Edward's hands were firm on the wheel, though she noticed the way his knuckles were slightly paler than usual. He wasn't relaxed, he wasn't calm, but he wasn't speaking either. She didn't ask him why he did it. She could have, she should have. But how do you ask a man why he kissed you when nothing in your carefully ordered, professionally respectful relationship had ever hinted at anything beyond duty? The kiss wasn't part of any plan. There had been no rehearsed lines, no whispers backstage, no signals. She'd shown up that evening prepared to refill his glass, remind him of names, and disappear into the background. That was their unspoken agreement. Their roles had been well defined, but now all of it blurred, all because of that one moment, that one kiss. She stared at her hands resting in her lap, the fingers that had touched his lapel, the lips that still remembered the surprising softness of his. And as Charleston blurred past her window like a dream she couldn't interpret, a single question repeated itself in her mind. That wasn't part of the deal. Was it ever a deal? Before the kiss? There were two quiet lives running in parallel, never meant to collide, yet somehow drawn together. It had been 14 months since Grace Bennett first walked into Edward Whitmore's office. The memory lived in the softened edges of autumn, her hands wrapped around a manila folder, the sound of her modest heels on the old wooden floors, the scent of sandalwood and espresso lingering faintly in the air. She wasn't supposed to stay. At least, that's what she'd told herself. The position had been temporary and executive assistant role she stumbled into after leaving her teaching career behind. The posting had been vague, but the offer was generous, and Charleston had been far enough from her old life to feel like a beginning. Edward had reviewed her resume in silence that first day. He barely looked at her, just motioned toward a seat and asked two questions. Can you keep things quiet, and can you work without needing to be seen? She'd nodded, he'd nodded back, and just like that, they began. Edward was the kind of man who filled a room without making noise. His office was neat, his schedule tighter than the clasp of his watch, and his requests always polite but brief. He never raised his voice, never fumbled, and never lingered longer than necessary. Grace, in turn, learned quickly. She memorized the order of his coffee black, no sugar, but a splash of oat milk if he was flying out that day. She kept his calendar precise, reminded him of names before meetings, and answered emails with a warmth that subtly softened his steel tone. They lived parallel lives, separate, structured, quietly efficient, but the days had a way of stacking up, and somewhere along the 8th week, something began to shift. It wasn't obvious. There were no grand gestures. Just a morning when she brought him a second coffee without asking, and he paused before taking it, a slight smile barely brushing his face, or the time his shoulder brushed hers by accident in the hallway, and neither of them moved away too quickly. The first trip they took together was to Savannah, a client meeting. Grace sat beside him on the train, typing notes while he reviewed figures. The ride was uneventful until he reached for a pen and accidentally knocked over her water. He apologized instantly, reaching for napkins. She laughed not at him, but at the way the water trailed down her skirt like a child's watercolor accident. It was the first time he saw her laugh like that, and something inside him paused. After that, their conversation stretched slightly longer. A comment about a book on his desk turned into a shared memory of teachers they once admired. A forgotten lunch order became an excuse to share a sandwich on a bench outside their building. Still, they kept things professional. Carefully so. Grace arrived at the office 15 minutes early every morning. She adjusted the blinds, set out documents, made sure everything was just as he liked it. And Edward, always precise, always controlled, began to notice the way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the way her fingers tapped lightly when she read something aloud under her breath. There was no drama, no flirtation, just two people slowly building a quiet kind of understanding. But quiet doesn't mean shallow. Grace never spoke about her past, But Edward noticed the way she tensed when the subject of children came up in conversation with clients. He noticed the way she always declined wine at lunch, not out of preference, but habit. He never pried, but he remembered, and she, in turn, noticed things about him too. The way he lingered a little too long at the edge of family events. The way he rarely took personal calls. The photo frame on his desk that remained face down, day after day, without explanation. They became used to each other's presence the way one becomes used to sunlight in a room, never overwhelming, but missed the moment it disappears. So, when Edward casually suggested they have dinner one evening, nothing formal, just a thank you. After a long week, Grace hesitated. She wanted to say yes. Part of her had been waiting for the offer, but the words that came out were measured. Thank you. But I'd rather not have anyone misunderstand what we are. Edward didn't argue. He simply nodded, lips pressed in a line, eyes unreadable, and that was it. No drama, no visible hurt, but something shifted again this time, in reverse. That night, Grace couldn't sleep. She sat by her kitchen window, tea cooling beside her, wondering why she felt a pang over something she herself had refused. It wasn't the dinner. It was what it symbolized, the beginning of a different kind of story. And she was scared of beginnings. She'd learned they came with endings. Across town, Edward stood alone in his office. The city had begun to light up, amber and golden through the wide glass panes. From his window, he could see the familiar pulse of Charleston settling into evening shop lights flickering on, couples strolling with soft laughter, the occasional bark of a distant dog. But his gaze didn't track the city. It remained fixed on the reflection in the glass, his own tired face, and in the faintest overlay, her eyes, calm, watchful, already walking away. And in that reflection, something within him whispered, she wasn't just efficient, she mattered. It wasn't a proposal. It was a request, simple, quiet, and utterly life-changing. The day had begun like many others, meetings, calls, deadlines. Grace had arrived early, as always, a soft cardigan draped over her shoulders and a latte balanced in one hand. She moved through the office with practiced ease, tidying papers, opening blinds, warming the space just enough before Edward walked in. But something was different. Edward's eyes were darker than usual, not tired, exactly, but tight. Focused in a way that suggested not business, but conflict. The kind that didn't show up in spreadsheets. She didn't ask. Not at first. The answer came later that afternoon when his mother, Marilyn Whitmore, arrived unannounced. Grace had only met her twice. Both times brief, both times cordial in that clipped Charleston way, compliments given with polite caution, questions delivered like subtle evaluations. Marilyn had the kind of presence that could turn a room into a chessboard and everyone else into pieces waiting to be moved. They spoke in Edward's office for nearly an hour. Grace couldn't hear the words, but she could see the gestures through the frosted glass, Marilyn leaning in, her hands folded tightly. Edward's jaw clenched as he listened without interrupting. When the door finally opened, Marilyn left with a nod to Grace, and not a single extra word. Edward remained behind, standing still in the middle of the room, one hand resting against the edge of his desk. Grace stepped in quietly and waited. "It's about the expansion," he said finally. "Europe." The board's hesitant. "They want." He paused, then almost laughed, but it was humorless. "They want signs of stability. Personal, not professional." Grace frowned gently. "They want you married." "No," he said. "Just settled, reassuring, presentable." She didn't respond, just waited, as she always did, letting the silence be space rather than pressure. He turned toward her then, and his voice lowered, not tense, not desperate, just careful. "Would you mind pretending, just for tonight?" Her breath caught not because she hadn't expected it, but because of how quietly he said it. No flourish, no performance, just a man asking something not small of someone he trusted. Grace looked at him for a long second. There was no amusement in his face, no manipulation, just vulnerability wrapped in control. She nodded once. Just for tonight. She echoed. That night, at a private reception for one of Edward's longest-standing investors, she wore a navy dress she hadn't pulled out since a wedding 5 years ago. She let her hair fall over one shoulder, added a necklace her sister had once given her, and practiced smiling without giving anything away. Edward met her at the car. He didn't say she looked nice. He didn't reach for her hand. But when their eyes met, something in his expression shifted, like he wasn't sure whether to thank her or apologize. Inside the event, the lines between real and pretend blurred fast. She was introduced as Grace. No last name, no title, just Grace. No one questioned her presence. Edward moved through the room with his usual quiet confidence, but his body remained angled slightly toward her, as if anchoring himself. When they stood together for photos, his hand brushed the back of her waist lightly, respectfully, but it lingered longer than necessary. She didn't move away. The next morning, her name appeared in a caption beneath a local paper's society column. Edward Whitmore arrives with longtime companion, Grace B. The B was enough. People who knew her would recognize the rest. Edward offered no explanation, no apologies. But 2 days later, another dinner came, then a gallery opening, then a charity brunch. Every time, the ask was unspoken, but so was her agreement. She told herself it was a favor, a service, a role she could play with minimal effort. And yet, each time he opened the car door for her, or stood just a little too close when someone asked if they were serious, she felt a flicker in her chest that had nothing to do with obligation. What made it hard wasn't the pretending. It was how little they had to fake. Grace already knew his schedule by heart, his habits, his moods. She could sense when he was about to excuse himself from a conversation, when his shoulder tightened, when he needed quiet. He, in turn, seemed to read her silences. When her hand twitched under the table at formal dinners, he'd slide her glass a bit closer. When a question at brunch veered too close to personal, he'd answer in her place with a calm deflection. It was choreography without rehearsal. But something about it still made her nervous, because it was too easy. The moment that caught her off guard came 3 weeks into the arrangement. A fundraiser, outdoor garden, warm night, twinkle lights, jazz humming, low beneath the canopy of stars. They were speaking with a small circle, an older couple from the preservation board, a woman from the Symphony Guild, when someone made a teasing remark about the newest Whitmore romance. Grace smiled politely, eyes fixed on her glass, and then Edward reached for her hand, just lightly, just enough to hold it. His palm was warm, steady, but there was a tremor. She felt it. A small, undeniable shake. It was gone in a second, but it had been there. That night, when the guests were gone and the city's lights shimmered through her apartment window, Grace sat alone on her couch. She stared at her hand, open in her lap. She thought about the weight of his fingers, the warmth that had lingered even after he let go. And she asked herself, not aloud, not dramatically, just quietly, was I pretending too? Or was that the first time someone held my hand and actually meant it? Some men speak with words, others speak with silence, and Edward's silence was thunder. The drive to his childhood home was quiet, but not empty. The kind of quiet filled with things not yet said, and memories that pressed against the windows like fog. They left Charleston before dawn. Edward insisted on driving, though Grace offered. The landscape changed gradually from cobbled streets and historic buildings to winding back roads lined with oak trees heavy with moss. The air smelled older here, wetter, like time had settled in and never left. As they passed a weather-worn sign reading, "Welcome to Ainsley," Grace glanced at Edward. His grip on the wheel hadn't changed, but something in his posture had. A slight tension at the neck, eyes flicking toward places the car passed, like ghosts might step out at any turn. He hadn't spoken much about the memorial, just that it was for her, and that he hadn't been back in years. She didn't ask questions. She knew better than to open a door before he was ready. the house came into view slowly, as if it were part of the land rather than built on it. A two-story white farmhouse with peeling shutters, set back behind a line of hydrangeas long past bloom. The porch sagged slightly in the middle. The rocking chair to the left creaked softly in the breeze, though no one sat there. Grace stepped out of the car and let the silence of the place settle around her. There was no noise, just the rustle of trees and the distant hum of cicadas. Edward stood beside her, staring at the house. He didn't move right away. "Is anyone here?" she asked gently. He shook his head. Not anymore. Inside, the house smelled of wood and time, not dust. It was clean, preserved in a way that felt deliberate, like someone had kept it waiting. Grace's fingers brushed along the top of a cabinet as they entered. Framed photos lined the hallway sepia tones, wedding portraits, a smiling girl holding a puppy, a young Edward in a football jersey. She paused at one picture, a woman with soft eyes and an open smile, holding a bouquet of wildflowers. She loved those, Edward said quietly behind her. Picked them every Sunday, even if we were running late for church. He didn't offer her name. Grace didn't ask. They moved through the rooms slowly. The living room had an old piano, untouched but polished. The kitchen still had a calendar pinned to the wall dated 7 years ago. The last square marked with Claire's appointment, 3 p.m. The master bedroom was closed. Edward didn't open it. Instead, he led her out to the back porch, where 2 wooden chairs faced the fields. He sat without speaking. She followed. The sun was lower now, casting gold over the tall grass. The air smelled like rain was thinking about arriving. Grace watched him from the corner of her eye. He sat forward slightly, elbows on his knees, eyes distant. And for the first time, he looked not like a businessman or a man in control, but like someone still standing in the middle of something unfinished. "My father built this porch," he said finally. But Claire picked the color, said white felt too lonely. Grace looked at the chipping blue-gray paint underfoot. It was soft, weathered. She was right, Grace said. They didn't speak for a while after that. When the first drops of rain tapped the railing, Edward stood and walked back inside. Grace followed, their steps soft on the worn floors. In what must have once been a study, he pulled open the bottom drawer of an old desk. Inside was a box wooden, carved with initials. He set it on the table and opened it slowly. Inside, letters, dozens, some yellowed, some newer, none sealed. She never got to read them. He said, Grace didn't reach for them. She simply waited. She died on a Tuesday. I was in Atlanta. I missed the call. By the time I got here, he swallowed. She was already gone. His voice didn't crack, but something in the room did. I kept writing to her. After, things I wish I'd said, things I wish she'd heard, stupid things. What I ate, what I dreamed, they didn't help. Grace stood near the window, watching the rain now falling steady against the glass. The scent of wet soil rose up, earthy and sharp. I used to think, she said softly, that talking would save everything, that if we could just speak honestly, things wouldn't fall apart. He looked at her then. Really looked. She took a breath. My husband and I lost a baby, a boy, 7 months in. I stopped talking after that. To him, to myself. And that silence was louder than grief. Edward said nothing, but his eyes didn't waver. We didn't make it, she continued, not because we stopped loving each other, but because neither of us knew how to carry what wasn't there anymore. Another pause, just long enough to let the truth settle. Then Edward reached into the box and pulled out a single envelope. It looked newer than the rest. He held it for a long moment, and then, quietly, he walked to the old fireplace and lit the corner of the letter. Grace stood still. The flame caught slowly, curling the edge of the paper inward. He watched it the whole time, eyes steady. Jaw clenched not as if erasing something, but releasing it. She stepped closer, not touching, just near enough to feel the heat. And in that quiet, with the rain outside and the ashes drifting upward, something passed between them. Not forgiveness, not closure, just understanding. Later, as the storm rolled heavier and the windows fogged, they sat on the couch in the old living room. The power flickered once, then held. She wrapped a blanket around her legs. He held a mug of tea he didn't drink. They didn't speak of work, or appearances, or pretending. Grace leaned her head against the back of the couch. Edward stared into the fireplace, now just glowing embers. There were no declarations, no dramatic releases, but somewhere in that room, amid the faded walls and whispered regrets, two hearts that had carried too much for too long began to soften. No promises, just presence. No words, just being. It wasn't the kiss itself. It was everything it said without saying a word. The Whitmore Foundation Gala returned like a tide, predictable in its ceremony, but never the same twice. The town square in Charleston shimmered with early evening gold. The same white lights hung from the oaks. The same jazz trio played, but for Edward Whitmore, everything felt different. This was the event where it had all started, where impulse became action. And now, a month later, they were back. Only this time, the silence between him and Grace had grown louder than any orchestra ever could. Grace stepped out of the car beside him, her heels barely clicking on the stone path, her dress a soft forest green that caught the light and refused to let it go. She smiled as cameras flashed. She nodded at familiar faces, but her hand didn't reach for his, and Edward didn't try to hold it. There were things you couldn't pretend anymore, not after what they'd been through. Grace had said yes to coming on the surface, but Edward could feel her retreat in the way she kept 3 inches of space between their shoulders, and how she asked about the evening schedule like it were just another work task. He knew why, and he didn't blame her. The moment the real moment was coming, he could feel it. It had been building since that night on the porch, since the letter turned to ash, since their silences had become less about distance and more about vulnerability. He hadn't told her what he planned to do, not because he wanted to surprise her, but because he didn't know if he was brave enough to follow through. The gala opened with speeches, soft applause, the hum of polite Charleston society clinking glasses and trading charity anecdotes. Grace stood beside Edward, smiling at donors, answering gentle questions about the Foundation's reading program, her idea. Actually, but no one in the crowd knew that. And then Clara Duval arrived. She was radiant, composed, everything a socialite was born to be. She moved through the crowd with the grace of someone used to being observed. But when she reached Edward and Grace, her gaze narrowed just slightly. Grace felt it first, a shift in the air, like static before a storm. "Edward," Clara said with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, "I hope you received the proposal package. My father and I were quite thorough." Her voice was honey and ice. Grace stiffened. Edward, to his credit, didn't flinch. He met Clara's gaze with calm. "I did," he said, "and I've given it a great deal of thought." Clara nodded, pleased. She turned to Grace. "It's rare to see Edward this domestic. I'm told you're his assistant." Grace smiled politely. "I was—" The past tense hovered in the air like perfume. Clara tilted her head, amused but sharp. "So, what are you now?" And that was when Edward moved. He turned to Grace, slowly, fully. And for a second, just a second, she saw it in his eyes. Not strategy, not panic, not charm, but truth. "I'm sorry," he whispered. And then, in front of cameras, donors, reporters, and one woman who was meant to secure his future, Edward reached for Grace and kissed her. It wasn't planned, it wasn't posed, but it was real. There was no hesitation in it, no performance, no calculation, just two hands that had carried too much, two hearts that had spoken in silence for too long, now trying fumbling to speak in the only way they still knew how. Grace didn't move right away. The pressure of his lips was gentle, but the noise around them fell away completely. For one suspended breath, it was only the warmth of him, the tremble of his hand, the sheer vulnerability of being chosen. But then reality surged back in through the lights, the cameras, the sound of someone gasping in the crowd. Grace pulled away, blinking, heart racing. Her voice was barely audible. "You didn't tell me." Edward's hand dropped. "I didn't know I would." Clara was already gone. So was the music. Only the weight of what just happened remained. Grace stepped back. "This isn't fair," she said. "Not to me." "Grace," he began. But she was already walking away. Through the crowd, through the light. Past the questions and eyes and speculation that now curled around her like smoke. Her heels echoed on the pavement, each step further from a moment that had taken months to arrive and only seconds to break her heart. She didn't answer his calls that night. She didn't even open her front door when the car pulled up and waited 5 whole minutes before driving away. Instead, she sat in the dark of her living room, still in the green dress, hands clenched together, heart pounding not from the kiss, but from everything it stirred, because she hadn't been kissed. She'd been exposed, put on display, named, claimed, framed by someone who hadn't asked her if she wanted that story told in public. It wasn't about love, it was about power, and she wasn't sure what hurt more, that he meant well, or that she almost wished he didn't. Edward sat alone in his office the next morning. No tie, no pressed jacket, just an untouched coffee and the silence he'd once worn like armor, but now felt like punishment. He didn't call her again, not out of pride, but because he didn't know what to say. There were no excuses. No rehearsed apologies could rewrite the way she had looked at him, hurt, exposed, confused, like a child shown off by a parent who wanted praise more than consent. He told himself it had been necessary, that the board would now leave him alone, that Clara would withdraw, that the rumors would settle, but none of it mattered. Not when Grace's absence filled the office like a missing wall. Every schedule alert she would have whispered, every second coffee she'd quietly placed by his side, every glance across the room when words weren't needed gone. Days passed. Grace returned to her routine, but it didn't feel like hers anymore. Her small apartment felt too big, the city too loud. Every time she saw a news headline about the gala, her stomach turned. She knew the story now. Whitmore romance confirmed Edward Whitmore's mystery, woman finally revealed, but none of them mentioned the part where she didn't get to choose. She wanted to believe he hadn't meant to hurt her, that the kiss had been genuine, but intention didn't erase impact, and love, if that was what it was, should never feel like a public unveiling. She tried to forget, to bury it, but one night, she found herself standing in her kitchen, staring at the untouched mug she used to bring to him each morning, and she whispered aloud to no one, "He kissed me, but he never asked if I wanted to be seen." At the same time, across town, Edward stood at the edge of his balcony, looking out over Charleston's harbor. The water glimmered under a low moon, steady and endless, and all he could think of was that moment, her eyes wide, her body still, her breath not quite catching up to her. He remembered the taste of regret even before she pulled away. The kiss hadn't been for the cameras, but it hadn't been just for her either, and he hated himself for not seeing that sooner. Sometimes, it's not the loud arguments that break us, it's the silence that lingers too long. The morning after the gala, Grace packed a single suitcase, locked her apartment, and left Charleston. She didn't tell Edward. She didn't tell anyone except her Aunt Lillian, who greeted her at the small porch of a yellow cottage nestled just outside Asheville. The air there smelled of pine and cinnamon, and the world seemed quieter, as if it knew she needed space to breathe. She told Lillian nothing, and Lillian, wise in the way only women past 60 can be asked even less. They lived side by side in an unspoken agreement. Silence was welcome, grief had its own timing, and healing wasn't something that could be rushed with words. Grace spent her days tending to Lillian's garden, reading old poetry, and cooking dinner slowly, as if flavor might anchor her back into herself. She ignored her phone, turned off notifications, left emails unanswered. She disappeared, and Edward let her, not because he wanted to, but because he didn't know how to hold someone without forcing them to stay. At the office, her absence was felt in all the small ways: the unwatered plant by the window, the printer that jammed and no longer auto-reset, the meetings that ran too long because no one gave him the subtle glance that said, Time's up. People stopped asking where she'd gone. The rumor mill spun. Of course, a lover's quarrel. A PR stunt. She wasn't who he thought she was. But Edward knew better. She hadn't left because of scandal. She had left because he hadn't asked if she wanted to stay. That knowledge kept him awake more than guilt ever could. And yet, he didn't reach out. Not through calls, not through emails, not through his mother, who curiously said nothing after the kiss heard, round Charleston. Instead, Edward found himself doing something he hadn't done in years. He went looking for her truth. He drove 3 hours south to the elementary school where Grace had once taught literature. He sat in the back of the auditorium while a new teacher ran reading groups. Afterward, he introduced himself not as a millionaire, not as her employer, just a friend. One retired colleague remembered her well. She used to sit with the quiet kids, the woman said, sipping from a chipped mug. The ones no one noticed. Grace didn't speak much, but they trusted her. She had that way about her, like silence wasn't emptiness, but invitation. Edward sat with that for a long time. He visited the small bookstore Grace had frequented, where the clerk remembered how she always picked second-hand poetry, Whitman, Dickinson, Bishop, and never bought bookmarks because she preferred torn receipts to mark her place. He went to the park nearby, the one with the iron bench facing the pond. There, a boy of about 10 sat tossing breadcrumbs to ducks. His name was Noah, one of Grace's former students. "She helped me when my mom left," he said bluntly, legs swinging. "Didn't tell me it was going to be okay. Just sat next to me and let me cry without saying anything." Edward sat beside him, silence folding between them. When they stood to leave, Edward pulled something from his coat pocket, a small envelope, handwritten, unsealed. He handed it to the boy. "Would you mind giving this to her?" he asked. Noah shrugged. "She still talks to me. I can find her." And just like that, the message was sent not by courier, not by email, but through the hands of someone who had once been seen by her. Grace didn't recognize the handwriting on the envelope at first. It was only one page, folded simply, without greeting or sign-off. But the moment she unfolded it, her hands trembled. I used to think silence was strength. That restraint proved control, and control proved worth. I now realize silence, when held too long, becomes a wall no one can climb, not even the person who built it. You were never part of a strategy. I didn't bring you into the spotlight to claim you. I did it because I'd finally seen something I didn't want to lose. And I didn't ask you if that was something you wanted to give. That was my fault, the day I kissed you. I forgot that you were never someone to be revealed. You were someone to be known. The words weren't poetic. They weren't dramatic. But Grace read the letter 3 times, each slower than the last. And then, quietly, she cried, not because it was sweet, but because for the first time, someone had chosen to see her without trying to explain her. She folded the letter and placed it beneath the ceramic bowl on the windowsill, between the rosemary plant and her aunt's old hummingbird feeder. She didn't call Edward, not yet. But she sat on the porch for a long time that evening, watching the sky change color, feeling the wind shift, letting herself imagine what it might mean to return, not as an assistant, not as an extension of someone else's image, but as Grace, whole, complex, and no longer invisible. Back in Charleston, Edward resumed his days without spectacle. No gala appearances, no interviews. He declined offers to comment on his relationship with a quiet, exhausted shake of the head. He didn't chase headlines. He waited, because for once in his life, he understood that waiting didn't mean weakness. It meant letting someone come back on their own terms. And if she never did, he would still know one thing: he had seen her, and he had told her so. 2 weeks later, a quiet knock landed on his office door. He looked up. She stood there, jeans, scarf, hair down, no makeup, not returning to work, just standing in her own name. He didn't smile, not out of coldness, but reverence. She walked in, slowly, the letter still folded in her coat pocket. Not to hand back, just to hold. "I came to ask something," she said. He nodded once, waiting. Her voice was steady. "Is this real, Or are we still pretending? Edward took a breath. No pretending, he said. Not anymore. She didn't cry, didn't smile, just sat down across from him, their knees nearly touching, and whispered, "Then let's not rush. Let's begin." She didn't come back as his assistant. She came back as herself, and that made all the difference. It had been nearly a month. Late autumn was folding itself into Charleston, the leaves rusting at the edges, the wind beginning to carry something colder than conversation. Edward had stopped checking his phone first thing in the morning, not because he'd given up, but because he was learning to let go without closing the door behind him. And so, when he received the call from the caretaker of the Ainsley house, the one with the peeling shutters and the hydrangeas long past bloom, he didn't say much. Just, "I'll be there before sunset." The house was exactly as they'd left it. Time didn't hurry out there. It just stood still and watched. Edward parked beneath the same trees, gravel crunching under his tires. He didn't rush toward the porch. Something told him she didn't want to be surprised. Instead, he walked quietly. No expectations, no rehearsed words. And there she was. Grace sat on the edge of the old porch swing, facing the lake behind the property. Her scarf moved slightly in the wind. A mug of tea half drunk, lukewarm, rested on the windowsill beside her. She didn't turn when he stepped up, but she didn't tense either. That, he thought, was something. He stood a few feet away, then slowly took the seat beside her, not too close, not too far, just near. For a while, they said nothing. Birdsong drifted through the bare trees. The scent of pine needles and old wood lingered in the air. Somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked with age. And then, softly, "I didn't come back for the job." Edward nodded. "I know." Grace exhaled slowly, her eyes still on the water. "I came back because I wanted to remember who I was before all of it. Before pretending, before applause and assumptions." Her voice didn't tremble. It was firm, not because she was angry, but because she'd found something steadier in the silence. Edward looked down at his hands, folded in his lap. "I thought I knew who you were," he said, "just from watching you work beside me. But the truth is I never asked." She glanced at him then, not sharply, just enough to let him know she heard that. She said, "let myself be seen only halfway." That was safer. The wind picked up, carrying leaves across the porch like small dancers with nowhere to go. "We hurt each other," Edward said quietly. "Not because we meant to, just because we weren't ready." Grace nodded. "And because we didn't know how to say what we wanted without fearing it might scare the other away." They sat with that truth a little longer. No justifications, no rewriting, just two people, grown and growing, owning the weight of their own hearts. Then Edward leaned back slightly, gazing up at the fading sky. "I took a leave," he said after a pause. 3 months. She turned to him. He smiled, gently. "First time in 20 years. My board nearly fainted. And your mother, still recovering?" They both chuckled low and short, but real. "And what are you going to do with 3 months of freedom?" Grace asked. He shrugged. "Figure out what I've missed, what I've let pass by because I thought ambition would protect me from regret." She looked down at the mug, swirled the last sip of tea around the bottom. "I think I forgot what it's like to be chosen without being needed," she said softly. "To be loved without being useful." Edward didn't respond immediately, but when he did, it wasn't with a promise or a plea. "Just this, if we start again," he said, "it won't be because I need saving. It'll be because you're the only thing that ever made me stop running." Grace looked up. There was no kiss, no sweeping gesture, only a stillness that felt like an answer. She stood slowly, wrapped her scarf tighter, and turned toward the steps, then paused. "If we start again," she said, her voice a near whisper, "let's not start with pretending." He nodded, standing beside her. "No pretending." He echoed, "Just beginning." And as they walked side by side into the fading light of evening, something in the air shifted, not closure, not yet a beginning, but the rare, quiet space where both could exist at once. Love, at this stage in life, isn't fireworks. It's blueprints and bricks and choosing to build together. Grace didn't move back into her apartment in Charleston. She rented a small place near the river, instead a two-bedroom cottage with creaky floors and sunlight that spilled generously across the kitchen each morning. Edward didn't return to the office either. His leave stretched on, and no one questioned it anymore. The business ran itself, as it turned out, when the people at the top finally learned to trust the ones beneath them. But neither Grace nor Edward spoke of resumes or roles. Instead, they began something quieter. Every morning, around 7:30, Edward would arrive at Grace's doorstep with 2 cups of coffee, one with cream, no sugar, one black. They would sit at her small wooden table, the kind that only fit 2, and talk. Not about work, about books, about childhood, about how the tomatoes in her garden were finally coming in. She told him about her old dog, Buckley, who used to chase the mail truck until he lost a tooth and never tried again. He told her how he once failed an entire semester in college because he refused to take a class that met before 9. Sometimes they laughed. Sometimes they didn't speak at all. But there was always something being built between them. Not with wood, with attention. One afternoon, they went grocery shopping together. A mundane task, but the kind that reveals so much. Edward insisted on reading every label, even for things he'd bought 100 times. Grace rolled her eyes and snuck 3 different kinds of cheese into the cart. "Variety is the soul of dinner," she said. He didn't argue. They made stir-fry that night, burned the first batch, ate the second while sitting on the floor of her living room, barefoot and unhurried. When she reached for the last piece of tofu, he let her have it. That, to her, meant more than roses. A week later, Edward invited her to meet an old friend, a retired lawyer named Jim, who now grew heirloom carrots and claimed they were better than therapy. They met at a farmer's market. Edward introduced her with no hesitation, no label to shield himself. Just, "This is Grace, the woman I'm seeing." It was the first time he'd said it aloud. Grace didn't blush. She didn't fidget. But something in her chest loosened, like a knot she hadn't realized was still tied. Because now she was no longer a shadow standing beside him. She was a choice named seen, included. Their days settled into a rhythm. Walks along the river, silent breakfasts, sudden detours to antique shops, where Edward pretended not to care about the difference between milk glass and opaline, but still paid close attention to which pieces Grace lingered over. One evening, as the sun melted into the trees, she told him about the dream she'd put away years ago, the one that still stirred in her some nights like a whisper. "I used to run a little program," she said, "free reading classes for kids who fell behind. Mostly after school, just me, some chalk, and a lot of stubborn hope." He listened without interrupting. "I stopped after the divorce," she said. "Didn't think anyone needed it, or me." Edward didn't say what he felt. Not right then. But the next morning, when she opened her mailbox, she found an envelope. No card, no note, just a folded check, and 3 words typed in the memo line from a quiet believer. She stood on her porch for a long while, sunlight brushing her face, the breeze carrying the scent of basil from the windowsill planter. She smiled, not because of the money, though it would help, but because he hadn't offered advice. He hadn't tried to solve her. He had simply said, "I see you, and I believe in what you love." They were still figuring it out, still unsure how to name this thing between them without reducing it. But every time they passed each other the salt without asking, every time their elbows brushed in the kitchen and neither pulled away, every time their eyes met across a shared silence, it felt like the foundation of something, not perfect, but real. And that, they were learning, was enough. She didn't need rescuing, she just needed someone who'd walk beside her without rushing ahead. After the kiss at the gala, after the silence, the letter, the beginning again came the scrutiny. It started quietly. A photo shared, a headline softened with question marks, a podcast episode debating whether Edward Whitmore, Charleston's most eligible widower, had finally settled and whether Grace Bennett was truly the kind of woman expected in such a role. Grace didn't read the articles, but she didn't have to. They found her anyway, at the grocery store, at church, in the eyes of strangers who looked too long, not with curiosity, but with calculation. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't young, in the way magazines defined it. She had no pedigree, no last name with weight, and yet there she was, walking beside him in quiet coffee shops and Sunday markets, hand resting gently on his elbow, laughter shared without apology. She never asked Edward to defend her, and he never did, because he didn't need to. Instead, he lived as if the noise didn't matter, as if being kind, being present, being real was the only form of rebuttal worth offering. He let her speak when she wanted. And when she didn't, he never pushed. He didn't try to fix anything. He just stayed. That, she realized, was how he said, "I choose you." One Thursday morning, over toast and marmalade, Edward folded his napkin carefully and cleared his throat. "My mother wants to meet you," he said. Grace paused, butter knife hovering midair. "Are you sure?" he smiled, eyes steady. "I didn't ask for her approval. I asked if she was ready to meet the woman I respect." The visit was set for the following Saturday. No fanfare, no press. Just a quiet lunch in the countryside, where Edward had grown up, a place with wide porches and deep chairs, where conversation happened slowly, like bread rising in a warm kitchen. Grace wore a navy dress. Nothing new. She brought along a jar of fig preserves, because Edward once mentioned his mother loved them. When they arrived, his mother, Margaret Whitmore, opened the door herself. She was tall, sharp-boned, and held her elegance like a sword tucked inside a velvet glove. For a moment, the air stood still. Then Margaret stepped forward and said, "I've heard you make a proper roast chicken." Grace blinked. "I do. With rosemary and lemon? Good. Come show me." And that was it. No interrogation, no icy glances, just two women in a kitchen, exchanging small stories and seasoning. Edward watched from the doorway, not hovering, just present. That day, nothing dramatic happened, no speeches, no tears. But when they left, Margaret pressed a small package into Grace's hands, a cookbook wrapped in faded linen. "It was mine," she said simply. "The notes inside are a bit stubborn, like me." Grace thanked her, heart full but words few. On the drive back, the sun dipped low, casting gold across the windshield. Grace sat quietly, fingers brushing the edges of the linen bundle. Then, without a word, she reached across the console and took Edward's hand. This time, it wasn't uncertain. There was no trembling, no second-guessing, just skin against skin, warm, steady, chosen. Edward didn't look at her. He didn't need to. Her fingers told him everything. She still heard whispers sometimes, still caught the glance of a neighbor who seemed to measure her worth against Edward's past, his title, his tailored life. But the noise softened because each time she made breakfast and he rinsed the dishes, each time she opened a book aloud and he simply listened, each time their steps matched on evening walks through their quiet part of town, she knew. Love wasn't about being led or saved. It was about walking side by side, even when the path wasn't clear, and holding a hand not to guide someone forward, but just to say, "I'm here, still here." They didn't buy a mansion. They found a house with a yellow porch, and it felt just right. It sat at the bend of a quiet river, where the breeze moved slow and the trees whispered instead of rustled. The porch faced west, catching the light in the golden hour, turning everything soft and warm, like old memories. The paint had chipped in places. The floorboards creaked, but Grace smiled the first time she saw it. "This is the one," she said. Edward didn't ask why. He didn't run numbers or call an architect. He simply looked at the yellow porch, the way the vines curled up the railing, and nodded. A week later, he sold one of his most historic properties in the heart of Charleston, not as a grand gesture, not to prove anything, but because somewhere along the way, he'd stopped craving applause and started craving quiet. He didn't tell the papers, didn't give a statement, just handed the keys to someone younger, someone with ambition in their eyes, and walked away with no need to be remembered. They moved into the yellow porch house on a Wednesday. It rained that morning, the kind of rain that makes the world smell like beginnings. Grace unpacked the kitchen first, arranging spices by feel instead of logic. Cinnamon near the window, sea salt by the stove. Edward focused on the walls. He picked out paint-soft sage for the living room, cloud blue for the bedroom. They painted together, getting more on their shirts than the brush. At one point, Grace turned around to find Edward standing on a step stool, brow furrowed, forehead streaked with a line of pale green. She laughed not loudly, but fully. It was the first time in years her laugh had echoed in her own home. The days took on their own shape. Mornings started with the sound of wind in the curtains and the smell of coffee drifting through the hall. Sometimes Edward cooked, sometimes Grace did, sometimes neither of them did, and they ended up eating toast on the porch in their pajamas, watching the birds argue in the fig tree. They planted a garden in the back. Not much, just some herbs, tomatoes, and a stubborn rosebush Grace had insisted on saving from the clearance rack. "It's leaning," Edward observed, inspecting it. "It's surviving," Grace replied, pressing the soil around its base. They didn't fix everything in a week. There were still quiet days when the past came knocking, still moments of hesitation, of wondering if the peace was real or just borrowed time. But the difference now was this: they spoke those doubts aloud, and then they stayed. One afternoon, as they sipped tea on the yellow porch, Grace reached into her lap and unfolded a small notebook. The cover was soft, leather-bound, the kind that made you want to write slowly. She clicked her pen once, paused, and wrote, "This time, I'm not afraid to stay." She didn't say it aloud. She didn't need to. Edward, sitting beside her with his feet up and sleeves rolled, leaned just slightly so his arm brushed hers. He didn't ask what she'd written, but he looked at her with that quiet certainty he always carried now, the kind that didn't promise forever, only that he'd be here tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. The yellow paint still chipped in places. The rosebush was still stubborn. The porch still creaked with every step. But for the first time in years, Grace looked at where she was and didn't feel the need to run. Not because everything was perfect, but because it was theirs, built slowly, painted gently, and held together not by grand gestures, but by the soft, steady hands of two people who had finally learned how to stay. She never thought she'd teach again. But love has a way of bringing back what we thought was gone. The oak tree in the backyard had stood for nearly 100 years. Its branches stretched wide like open arms, and the ground beneath was always cool, even in the summer heat. One morning, Grace walked out onto the grass, barefoot, a cup of tea in hand. She looked up at the leaves shimmering in the breeze and whispered, "You'd make a good classroom, wouldn't you?" It began with a flyer, just a simple note pinned outside the church and the local bakery. Afternoon reading and storytelling under the oak tree. Free. Ages 6 to 12. Come as you are. She didn't expect much, but on the first Monday, 3 children came. On Wednesday, there were 6. By the second week, the grass beneath the tree held a dozen small voices, chattering and laughing, books open in their laps, knees stained green from the lawn. There were no desks, no chalkboard, no bells or lessons plans, just Grace, sitting cross-legged on a woven mat, reading aloud stories about lost dogs, brave queens, and boys who learned to bake bread instead of fight dragons. She didn't ask for homework. She asked for stories. What made you smile today? What's the best smell in your kitchen? If you could talk to trees, what would they say? The children bloomed like the flowers they ran through to get there. Edward didn't join the group directly. He stayed near the porch, watching from a quiet distance, a mug in one hand and a tray of cookies in the other. Some afternoons, he brought lemonade. Other days, apple slices with peanut butter and a stack of napkins folded just right. The kids began calling him Mr. Tea and Cookies. He never corrected them. Sometimes, when the children left, Grace would find Edward still sitting there, smiling not at her, but at the space they had built together, The oak became a sanctuary, a place where scraped knees didn't need bandages, just time, where shy voices slowly grew brave, where Grace remembered what it meant to give without needing to prove her worth. One little girl, quiet, with big eyes and sleeves that covered her wrists, returned each day. Never speaking much, she'd sit close, but not too close. She listened more than she read. She drew small pictures in the margins of her notebook. One afternoon, as the other kids packed up, the girl lingered. Grace knelt beside her. "Would you like to stay a little longer?" The girl nodded. They sat beneath the oak, just the two of them, as the sun tilted west and shadows stretched like sleepy arms. After a moment, the girl spoke, barely above a whisper. "Can you be the mom I never got to have?" Grace didn't answer right away. Her throat caught, not from sadness, but from the sheer weight of being asked so honestly, so vulnerably for something so big. She looked up. Edward was standing at the porch, hands in his pockets. He hadn't heard the words, but something in her gaze must have told him everything. He nodded once, slowly, softly, as if to say, "You can do this. I'll be right here." Grace turned back to the girl and brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "I can't be everything," she said gently, "but I can be someone who stays." The girl smiled. It was small, but real. That night, after the kids had gone and the yard was quiet again, Grace stood under the oak tree, barefoot, same as the morning she first dreamed of it. Edward joined her, his arm brushing hers, the evening light turning the porch behind them gold. "You always knew this would happen," she said, watching the wind shift the grass. "No," he replied. "I just knew you needed a place to begin again." The classroom under the oak tree didn't win awards. It wasn't featured in any papers. There were no certificates, no grants, no headlines. But something more important happened there. Children felt safe, stories were told, and a woman who had once been broken remembered that healing didn't need a ceremony. It only needed sunlight, a bit of soil, and someone willing to stay. The loudest kind of love doesn't shout, it simply stays. The afternoon stretched long and slow, like honey from a warm spoon. On the porch with the yellow paint, Edward sat in his usual chair, a book open on his lap. He wasn't reading so much as resting his eyes on the words, letting the weight of the day melt quietly around him. Grace was beside him, not quite leaning, not quite apart, just there. She had a small notebook balanced on one knee, a pen in hand, tapping gently against the margin. Not writing much, just enough to feel the page listening. The tea had gone lukewarm. Neither of them minded. Under their chairs, the old tabby cat from next door had adopted them again, sprawled out across the wood slats, belly up, as if he'd always belonged there. The wind was soft that day, not enough to lift the leaves, just enough to carry the scent of lemon balm and old pine. The river behind the house murmured its usual song, low and steady, like it had for generations. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. On the table between them sat a small wooden frame. Inside, a photograph. Two figures beneath a tree. She wore a soft blue dress. He, a linen shirt, sleeves rolled, no veil, no suit, no crowd. Just wildflowers in her hand and sunlight on his face. They had married on a Tuesday, with dew still on the grass. No guest list, no cake, just a promise whispered under breath, and a shared laugh when the cat decided to walk through the middle of it all. It had been months ago, maybe more. Time had stopped moving the way it used to. Now, it just breathed. Edward turned a page, slowly. Grace drew a tiny asterisk in the corner of her journal, then another beside it. No meaning, just rhythm. From inside the house, the faint ticking of a clock mingled with the distant creak of an old ceiling fan. No one was in a hurry. The light began to shift, brushing across the porch in stripes, dappling their hands and laps with patches of gold. Grace reached over and adjusted Edward's mug so it wouldn't spill. He didn't look up, but his fingers gently touched hers. Briefly, that was all. A moment. Not dramatic, not decorated, just real. As the sun began to dip, casting everything in that soft, in-between light, Grace closed her notebook. She looked out over the garden where the rosebush still bloomed, wild and uneven, where children's laughter sometimes returned, like echoes that had learned to stay. She exhaled through her nose, a long, slow breath, not because she was tired, but because it was enough. Everything in that moment, the fading light, the book unread, the tea untouched, the cat asleep, the hand brushed, the memory framed, all of it said more than any vow ever could. They didn't need a forever promise, just one more ordinary day, together. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive with fireworks or grand gestures. It comes quietly through small acts, soft glances, and the courage to stay. This story reminds us that healing is not always loud. For many of us who have lived through loss, regret, or the long silence of loneliness, it's easy to believe our most meaningful chapters are behind us. But maybe, the most beautiful kind of love doesn't rush in our youth. It arrives when we've finally learned how to listen, how to sit in silence without fear, how to hold someone's hand not to lead them, but to walk beside them. Edward and Grace didn't fall in love like the movies. They grew into love through honesty, stillness, and choosing each other again and again. And maybe that's the lesson. It's never too late to begin again, not with noise, not with perfection, but with presence, with quiet, and with a heart that's still willing to stay. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. If this story touched your heart, reminded you of something you've once lost, or something you're still hoping for, we're truly grateful to have shared this moment with you. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories that speak to the soul. Until next time, stay kind, stay open, and stay with the stories that matter.